When we said earlier that the US is literally freaking out because of BRICS de-dollarization efforts, some people, especially those in the West, felt we were just making noise. But the truth is that the authorities in Top Gun are actually scared of the massive push by BRICS to reduce reliance on the dollars and for countries to begin to use local currencies for international trade. But how do we know that? Well, apart from the fact that a lot of countries are beginning to trade bilaterally in their local currencies, the US presidential candidate, Donald Trump, has said it with his own mouth not once, but twice. For Trump to say it out, it means that it has been discussed among the US top officials that support him, and for it to be discussed, it means that it is not a minor issue. Now, the first time Trump raised this issue was in April this year during one of his presidential campaign speeches. He said that if he wins the election, he would not allow other countries to abandon the dollar. In his own words, "I don't want people leaving the dollar, and I feel that way, but I will tell you, it has taken on a life. I hate when countries go off the dollar. I would not allow countries to go off the dollar because when we lose that standard, that will be like losing a revolutionary war. That will be a hit to our country, just like losing a war, and we can't let that happen, and too many countries now are fighting to get off the dollar."
Well, it's a great question. The problem with what we have with sanctions, and I was a user of sanctions, but I'd put them on and take them off as quickly as possible because ultimately it kills your dollar and it kills everything the dollar represents, and we have to continue to have that be the world currency. I think it's important. I think it would be losing a war. If we lost the dollar as the world currency, I think that would be the equivalent of losing a war. That would make us a third world country, and we can't let it happen.
For Trump to include it as a part of his campaign promises, then it means that the issue of de-dollarization is a big problem for the United States. But April wasn't the only time Trump reiterated his promise. He said it again very recently, and this time it wasn't just a promise of stopping countries from ditching the dollar. No, this time he said how he planned to stop countries from ditching the dollar, and guess how Trump's administration plans to do that? Well, it shouldn't be too hard to figure out. Trump simply plans to use the US most favorite weapon, threat, and sanction. Now, Trump said this during a rally in Wisconsin. Speaking to those present, the US presidential candidate sent a strong warning to every country considering ditching the dollar for international trade. In his speech, Trump pledged to sanction these countries by imposing a 100% tariff on any country that dares to shift away from the dollar, a move that intensifies his protectionist trade platform.
Former President Donald Trump has pledged to impose a 100% tariff on countries that move away from using the US dollar in international trade. Speaking at a rally in Wisconsin, Trump said any nation abandoning the dollar would face severe trade penalties with the United States. His remarks come as the dominance of the US dollar, which still accounts for 59% of global foreign exchange reserves, according to the IMF, is being challenged by growing discussions of de-dollarization.
Once the US starts issuing threats and mentioning sanctions, then it's no longer a minor issue. Trump went on to emphasize and highlight that abandoning the US dollars for international trade would effectively mean losing access to the US market. In simple terms, if any country abandons the dollar, that country would no longer be financially feasible to conduct business with the United States. Now, according to Trump, this move or tactic is simply a defense of the US dollar, which he claims has been under siege for the past few years. He went on to further express his concerns over the growing discussions among member countries of the BRICS alliance, including China and Russia, to reduce reliance on the dollar and conduct trade between countries and currencies other than the dollar. Trump made reference to the BRICS summit last year, which effectively pushed the de-dollarization agenda and reiterated his desire and promise to ensure that the dollar remains the world's dominant reserve currency. Yes, the US dollar is still the world's reserve currency, contributing for nearly 60% of global trade. However, the fact is that it has been in the decline for several years, and the de-dollarization campaign by BRICS has opened the eyes of many nations that there is an alternative to using the dollar for trade. You see, using the dollars for international trade and as a reserve currency was beneficial to the United States, but for those countries using it, it's a big problem. For some of them, especially those in developing countries such as African countries. Using the dollar for trade has weakened their local currency, thereby affecting their economies. But apart from this, using the dollar as a reserve currency means that every country in the world that is not an ally of the United States or disagrees with the U.S. stance on any issue at any point in time risks being sanctioned financially and economically. It's no longer news that since the U.S. became the world's superpower in everything, including economically, it has wielded economic sanctions as a weapon and a political tool to strangle countries that it feels are a threat, and countries that refuse to follow its ideals, principles, and interests. A lot of countries, including China, Russia, Iran, and several African countries, have been subject to the U.S. sanctions. Russia is one of the most recent countries that is currently experiencing brutal sanctions imposed by the U.S. Essentially, the United States has become the global bully, using threats and sanctions to ensure that everything goes its way. Remember earlier this year, after South Africa took Israel to court for committing genocide? Well, while the whole court case was going on, the U.S. Congress threatened to remove South Africa from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which gives African countries duty-free access to the U.S. market, for daring to take its ally, Israel, to court. So, given this situation, it absolutely makes a lot of sense that countries around the world would grab an alternative to using the U.S. dollars for international trade, not just to protect their local currencies, but also to shut down the risk of sanctions. But typical of the United States. Instead of looking for other ways to stop countries from ditching the U.S. dollars, Trump feels that threatening countries is the perfect way to go. Honestly, that's just dumb. How can you use the same tactic that made these countries want to ditch the dollar in the first place to stop them from ditching the dollar? Doesn't make sense. But I guess the only way the U.S. knows to solve issues is through threats, sanctions, and war. We are not the only ones that think that threatening these countries is a smart idea. Some analysts, including Ulrich Leuchtmann, the head of foreign exchange research at Commerzbank AG, have warned of the potential consequences of Trump's harsh approach to tariffs. According to Ulrich, Trump's proposed tariffs can actually backfire and even incentivize many more countries to abandon the dollar, causing major disruption to global markets. This could effectively weaken the dollar's dominant status and trigger a depreciation of the currency. If you think about it, these analysts are right. Do you think threatening a 100% tariff would stop China or Russia from pushing the de-dollarization campaign? Of course not. Certainly for countries that need access to the U.S. market for trade, the 100% tariff might make them reconsider, but it also makes it obvious to these countries that the United States is a bully, and there is a chance that it might not even be enough to stop them from ditching the dollar. Think about it. The United States is large, quite all right, and has a large market base, but with the imposition of the 100% tariff, countries can decide to look for another market. It's as simple as that. Africa, for example, has a very large market base, even more than that of the US. Asia is also there as well. So, imposing a 100% tariff is not really much of a threat, and it's the US that will suffer from this protectionist policy. It seems Donald Trump forgot that there is always an alternative. Since the US imposed stringent sanctions on Russia, Russia has found a way to survive, creating an alternative to the SWIFT payment system and building alliances with countries from Africa. When the US imposed sanctions on Zimbabwe, which lasted for 20 years, the country suffered from this sanction, but it is still surviving. So threatening these countries is really not a smart idea. However, some analysts believe that Trump's protectionist policy may not be a bad idea. They argue that Trump's focus on driving U.S. economic growth and his protectionist trade policies might bolster the strength of the dollar. Well, regardless of what they believe, the fact is that there is a very high risk of this policy backfiring because BRICS has no plans of stopping the de-dollarization campaign anytime soon. The idea of de-dollarization is not a far-fetched dream anymore. China and Russia seem to be fixated on the idea of systematically killing the demand for the US dollar through global trade, and sooner or later, this will happen. What are your thoughts? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video.